Good evening and welcome to the second of our three-part horticulture lecture series. I'm Kathy Deutsch, Director of Horticulture, and on behalf of the Friends of Horticulture, we are delighted you are joining us tonight. I want to thank the lecture sponsors recognized on this slide for generously supporting this series. In just a moment, we'll have James Golden, but first, a bit of show and tell to lure you to Wave Hill. It was cold this week, but we have notes of color and fragrance that are keeping us warm. From the Palm House's South African bulb collection, we have Sparaxis elegans. These are unscented, however, their appeal is in the radial symmetry of the flower petals, and the dark purple anthers are coiled and twisted around the style. It's very cool when you're up close and in person. So do come visit. And then, of course, from the garden, we have the fragrance, the sweet spicy scent of Hamamelis Orange Beauty, which always makes its way around the garden. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon for a Q&A. If you have questions for James, you can type them here and I will relay them to him at the end of his talk. And with that, I think that we can get started. Federal Twist makes the global bucket list of must-see gardens. This past October, the Wave Hill gardeners and interns, along with Louis, Marco, and a few other horticultural dignitaries, were lucky enough to tour Federal Twist with James Golden during the peak of its fall splendor. We listened intently as James regaled us with the evolution of this ethereal and evocative place. Eventually, we all set off in different directions, lured by a plant or path, only to discover we had lost each other within the small acre-and-a-half parcel. The garden is a disorienting discovery of nooks and landscape microcosms that blur the line between natural and designed. As he began composing the garden, he decided to write about it and other gardens in his now well-known blog, The View from Federal Twist. 15 years on, James is a celebrated garden designer and thinker whose garden, Federal Twist, has been featured in all the best horticultural publications and in Monty Don's famed BBC series, American Gardens. He is revered by today's most influential garden designers for creating a truly esoteric blend of ecology and innovation. James recently published a new book on his garden, which I was fortunate to receive just the other day. It is The View from Federal Twist, a new way of thinking about gardens, nature, and ourselves, which is due out on March 1st. We are delighted to welcome tonight James Golden.
Thank you, Kathy. It's an honor to be able to talk to Wave Hill and his friends tonight. Wow, what an introduction. I don't know if I can live up to it. This is the cover of my book, but I'm also showing it to you because it shows a bit of the house in the upper left corner. I think this provides a good orientation for the beginning of my presentation because the garden spreads out before the house, much of it lower than the house, and to the sides of the house and even to the other side of the house. That wall of windows is like an observatory. I wake up every morning and look out, hopefully at the sunrise. On cloudy days, maybe I'll see fog. Or I can stand on the terrace on the outside those windows, or sit in the chairs and just enjoy the garden. When we bought the house in 2004, this is what the garden looked like, or rather the space that was to become the garden. It was a rather derelict wood of eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, and lots of multiflora rose. It was a real wasteland. Uh, Sort of frightening, actually. But I would like to pause just a moment to think that this is also a very characterful scene. Perhaps it could remind you of some images you had as a child reading Hansel and Gretel or some other fairy tale. This is another scene of that derelict wood behind the house. I knew, looking out over this land when I stood at the window with the real estate agent, that I was making a big trade-off. I was choosing a house I wanted and giving myself a huge challenge. I had no doubt that I would make a garden here, but at the time I did not know how I would do it. Again, I recognized a characterful presence in this woodland. Just left to center, you see a big, twisted, dead tree, and behind it a spray of yellow leaves. The junipers make black verticals across the background. It's a characterful scene, again, one reminiscent of a fairy tale, and something I might want to keep in the garden. But first we had to create some open space. There was no open space around the house. When the house was built in 1965, there was an open field behind it, but over the years junipers had seeded in, and some had grown quite large. So in the spring of 2005, we hired a contractor to cut down 70 to 80 trees and clear out much of the multiflora rows. He removed the structures above ground, but he didn't remove the roots below ground. And when he left, and I looked on this scene, I looked on those muddy ruts, and what did I think? I thought, I have to have an ecological garden. There are many plants I can't grow here. I have to find out what plants will grow in muddy, heavy, wet clay. And behind those ruts, you'll see the ground beginning to green. I knew by midsummer that thin greenness would become weeds 3 or 4 feet tall. So I needed a plan for how to control the ground surface. And I'd been reading a lot. In fact, I would say much of my garden came about through the reading I did, much more so than practical horticultural experience in the garden. This is the garden that summer. I knew I had to buy lots of plants and experiment. I also researched plants to try to identify things that I thought would live in my conditions. You can see it's a mess. There are lots of plant tags. It's pretty chaotic. But over the years, I was able to identify plants that would succeed under these conditions. In the middle of the summer, I began to think about design. I didn't know what to do with this blank open field. And sort of in frustration, I got out a mower and mowed this wavy path across the field. And that was a real revelation for me. After I mowed it, scalped the earth a bit, I was able to actually see the soil. I was able to see slight changes in elevation as I walked along the path. I was able to look at the house and look at other areas of the open field and begin to get some sort of idea, a feeling for the space. Where the mower had cut weeds open at the edge of the path, I could see deeply into their structure and into how they rooted in the earth. This was a sort of magical moment for me. It was the first time I really felt at one with this place. The ecological is an alternative to the highly manicured and resource maintenance intensive gardens we have in most of our country. At the time I started Federal Twist, I didn't intend to make a demonstration garden for how to avoid having a suburban lawn, but it in fact is that. This photo illustrates an idea I got from Noel Kingsbury. He wrote many of Pete Outhoff's early books with Pete. And in one of Noel's earlier books, which he wrote alone, I read a short chapter on how to plant directly into rough grass. Noel said one could do that and create a kind of rough prairie. So I took that idea and ran with it. His recipe was first to dig a big hole, second to buy a big, highly competitive plant and to plant it in that hole, and then to repeat that process over and over again many times. The idea was that the big competitive plants would quickly grow up and shade out the lower vegetation and maintain control over the ground surface. I don't have access to a pointer, so I'll try to direct you. In the middle top, there's a miscanthus, which by midsummer will probably be 3 or 4 or 5 feet wide. Just to the right of that is a bunch of Silphium terebinthinaceum, which is a prairie plant from our Midwest. You can even see it seeded around a bit throughout the area. Toward the lower left are 2 Rudbeckia maxima, 2 other quite large plants. Down in the lower front, you can barely see just a bit of Silphium perfoliatum, or cup plant, which is another prairie plant from our Midwest. There's some scattered daylilies, hemerocallis, around, and if you look closely in the upper left, you'll see some Equisetum arvenzi, or horsetail, which is indigenous to my site. You can also see the ground surface, but this will be visible only for a few weeks. It will close up. To make sure I covered the ground completely, I also used plants indigenous to the site. Here you see a beautiful fern, sensitive fern, Onoclea sensibilis, and more of the Equisetum with the wiry stems mixed in with the sensitive ferns. And another view, there's a large plant in the center. It's another prairie plant with the highly dissected leaves is Silphium licineatum, also known as compass plant. To its right is an even larger plant, Inula racemosa Sonnenspier, which is from the area of the Himalayas and came to us, I think, through Germany. I say that because of the name Sonnenspier. It was used quite a bit by Wolfgang Irma of Irma van Sweden Associates. He was a rather wild and crazy plantsman, and that reputation led me to try out this plant, which has become a mainstay of my garden. Both of these plants will be easily 8 to 10 feet tall by midsummer. To the far right, you see a Euphorbia palustris, which loves the wet conditions in the soil. This euphorbia has seeded all across the garden and flowers in early spring with beautiful golden flowers. And the back is more sanguisorba. Another view of low plants used as ground cover. The yellow flowering one used to be called Senecio aureus. Now it's Pacara aurea. It's quite vigorous. It's a wonderful ground cover. Some people think it's too vigorous, but they might say that of many of the plants I grow. You see a lot of equisetum with the wiry leaves and sanguisorba in the background. And this is just a shot in early summer to show you how thick prairie vegetation can and should be. There are probably over 100 plants in a square yard here. And in a square yard of natural prairie, there may be several hundred plants. So this is the method I use to control the ground surface. Thomas Rayner and Claudia West call it green mulch in their book, Planting in a Post-Wild World. In 3 or 4 years, I had achieved something like an out-off-esque effect, using a lot of miscanthus and eupatorium, the Joe Pye weed, and other plants. But the garden was still rather thinly planted, and I knew I had a lot more work to do. By this time, I was also paying more attention to the trees that make up the clearing and the wood. That wall of trees became very important as an integral component of the garden. I'll show you a map just quickly for orientation, and you don't need to remember any of this. The house is in the upper right. You can see the squarish, boxy shape. Outside it, below it on the map, is the terrace, and then there's a bank going down to the prairie garden, which is about 12 feet below the house. There's a pond, there are 2 reflecting pools, and there's a plethora of paths because the garden is designed to be immersive and to be to more or less force visitors to encounter the plants. And I'm showing you one more shot of the house just to emphasize the importance of the house as the kind of center of the garden and the observatory for seeing what is going on. Not that you can see the whole garden from the house. I call Federal Twist a landscape garden. Up to now, I've been showing you close-up photos of the prairie garden, which in this photo is hidden in the darkness below. Here we see in the foreground plantings along the edge of the terrace, which do a lot to screen the lower garden and make it invisible. And then we see the sun rising behind the woods on the other side of the garden. So I put it to you, is the garden below, or is the garden what we see in this photograph? I think the trees surrounding the garden are very much an integral part of the garden. If you tried to find a boundary between garden and ungardened wood, you couldn't, because they blend together, and that line would move hundreds of feet with the changing seasons. Here's another view, a long view of the garden from down in the lower prairie garden. You might take a look at that Petasites in the foreground and say, I don't think that's a prairie plant. Well, it's certainly not, but it does a good job of covering the ground, and to my mind, it's a quite beautiful plant. Excuse me. It's also a plant I would not recommend anyone use. It should always come with a warning level. It's highly invasive. You have to give a lot of attention to it and control it. But it's beautiful, so I grow it in my garden, and it does the job I want want to do. This is pretty much the same view in autumn. The trees have begun to defoliate, and you can begin to see more deeply into the surrounding woodland. In a sense, the garden is expanding, getting larger. When you are up by the house looking out across the garden, you will see far more deeply into the woods, and the garden will seem to be much larger. This is looking back toward the house. The people who built the house in 1965 planted these 3 sycamores, which have become a dominant feature. They shade the house, help it to keep cool in the summer, and they provide wonderful shade and dappled lighting to people sitting out on the terrace or walking across the terrace. Certainly a major feature of the garden. This is another view from the terrace looking across in late November, just showing how beautiful the senescence and the dying plants look in the foggy light. There's a dying small tree on the right, a lindera next to the miscanthus on the left. This is, I think, my favorite season in the garden as it passes into death for the winter. This is even a later photograph. You can see the trees are fully defoliated, so much so that you can see a hilltop in the distance. This is a hill across the Lockatong Creek Valley, probably a quarter to a half mile away. So in a sense, the garden is breathing out and swelling and taking in more space. This is a late autumn view on the terrace. The dead tree used to be a weeping Japanese cherry. It looked totally inappropriate in this environment. And I was so glad when it died. So I kept it as this multi-stem snag for many years. An interesting thing about this photograph is that you cannot easily tell planted garden from unplanted garden. They blend so completely together. Another view. One of the beautiful things about a clearing in the woods is that you get this oculus. You get this slice of sky that's constantly visible, so that you're able to enjoy unique cloud formations and unusual effects of the weather. And this is a late winter photograph. Some people might see this as melancholy, even a bit frightening. I find a certain comfort in it. It certainly brings to mind the end of the garden for the season and the dying of the plants, at least above ground. I think it's a highly picturesque view of the garden, one I was lucky to catch in a certain moment. Now I'd like to tell you about moving through the garden, the prairie garden. And I use the words open, closed, open to emphasize that as you move through the garden, you're encountering openness and closure repeatedly. In a sense, the garden pushes back a bit. If you look at this sort of seething mass of prairie plants, you wouldn't think of entering. It pretty clearly is signaling you in some way, unconsciously perhaps, that you don't enter here. You walk on the paths and explore the garden in that way. I meant this intentionally to gently remind people that our earth is in the state it is because we have not kept parts of it apart. We have used it all. We probably should be saving half the earth without just for diversity of life for the future. I don't mean to preach, which I seem to be doing now, but that was the concept in having the garden. Just push back a bit. Here's another view of the prairie in late autumn. The tall plants in the foreground are the Inula racemosa Sonnenspier, very characterful plants, beautiful with the yellowing miscanthus. But again, this part of the garden pushes back a bit. And this is open. This is the central path across the garden. In fact, it was that path I first mowed across the garden before I had a garden. So this is open for passage, closed, open, closed, open, closed, open, closed, open, open and closed. Here the pathway weaves behind sort of monolithic planting, really self-seated Inula, to a bench that's hidden behind that hydrangea, and then the path continues around and out on the other side. Another way of looking at this is to view the garden as having permeable and impermeable areas. And this is the path coming out on the other side. So open and closed. Open and closed. This is a view of the lower reflecting pool through a scrim of planting. I'm on a pathway many feet away from that pool. And it's not so easy to get to the pool. You have to actually do a little searching to find a pathway through. And this aerial photo shows where that pathway goes. It's the narrow pathway in the upper left. But to get to that, you have to go through two other pathways that force you to come into contact with some plants. That was intentional, because this is an intentionally immersive garden, and I want you to pay attention to the plants and see the plants. The plants have to fit ecologically. This is the point I knew from the beginning, but I thought I should show you some of the plants that made the cut. This is another plant from the Midwestern prairies, Philippingula rubra venusta, also known as Queen of the Prairie. We don't have many good nurseries, and when I was first planting the garden in the early years, I was working in the city, and I would come out on weekends and travel in my car from nursery to nursery, seeking out plants for my garden. And luckily, I found a place across the river in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, Paxson Hill Farm, that had a quite unique selection of plants. So this was my first use of the Noel Kingsbury method of planting a big competitive plant into a big hole. I bought 30 or 40 of these plants and put them in across a 50 or 60-foot swath of the garden, and they became the foundation for the prairie planting. They have endured over the years, probably 12 or 13 years. They haven't grown out of bounds by any means, but they also haven't diminished. They remain vigorous and grow in place. This is the flower in bud, and the filipendula in full flower. And this is the flower as it fades to a beautiful bronze color. They're quite beautiful in the fall. Sanguisorba does well in my heavy wet clay conditions. This is Filipendula ulmaria, or meadowsweet, which likes wet conditions. Euphorbia palustris, which covers the garden in early spring. And this flower is magnified a bit, but it has beautiful umbelliferous flower heads that just cover the garden in early spring when there's no other color. Another prairie plant, Silphium laciniatum, also known as compass plant. These deeply cut leaves, some get to be maybe 30 inches long and 1.5 feet wide. They have a very heavy sandpapery texture, certainly a unique foliage shape in the garden. This is the same plant, the Silphium laciniatum. These plants grow very tall. They flower. They grow probably 8 to 10 feet. Many of them do, and then they flop over. If you've been to the High Line in midsummer, you've seen many of these fallen across the flowers. This one happened to fall quite gracefully. This is another Silphium perfoliatum cup plant with a bee pollinating. More Silphium. All of the Silphium perfoliatum, the cup plant in the garden, was self-seeded. I simply broadcast the seed and it came up in a couple of years. There's a lot of it. It's one of the mainstays of the prairie garden. But there are other things that aren't usually prairie plants. On the far right, you'll see daylily Hemeracalis altissima. These are a great supplement to the plants of the garden. Because my conditions prevent me from growing many of the plants I would like to grow, I have to find substitutes. And Hemeracalis seems to do very well under the conditions. More Silphium perfoliatum. At times it's so high you can look up and see it against the sky. This is an unusual shrub, Zenobia pulverulenta. It has beautiful glaucous foliage. Did I say it's native? It's native. I find them hard to locate. I bought these at a plant sale many years ago. Very well adapted to wet clay. And it has beautiful red color in autumn. Back in one corner, I planted several paniculate hydrangeas of different kinds, and I was shocked at how well they do. They grow very vigorously and have to be pruned well every spring. Buttonbush Cephalanthus occidentalis, a plant I think we all know. It loves wet conditions. It's a native plant. And here's a hovering hummingbird moth. Veronicastrum. Veronicastrum is barely made the cut in my garden. It does survive. It grows quite well. It's reliable. It comes back every year. But I know it often expands to become a very large plant in gardens with much better soil conditions than I can offer it. So it simply hangs around and adds a bit of color and interest. This is New England aster, Aster novi anglii. Forgive my Latin pronunciation. Everyone does it differently, I think. All of these were self-seeded, and they're all over the garden in autumn. Sanguisorba canadensis, our native Sanguisorba. It seeds about quite a bit, but makes good-looking colonies, and it's easily controlled. Mountain mint, a great pollinator plant. It's usually covered with insects in the summer. The local native geranium, it's indigenous to the site of my garden, Geranium sylvaticum. It pops up all over the place in sun and shade. It's best in shade. The color is best in shade. Smilacina, false Solomon seal, definitely a plant I bought. It did not do well down in the wet conditions of the garden, so I planted it here at the top of a stone wall. And notice the green mulch around it, which is Equiseta marvensi. The Equisetum is far superior visually and ecologically to wood mulch or bark mulch. Joe Pye weed, a favorite. I love the plant. This is a plant that put itself in the garden through itself seeded, and I've come to love it. It's dogbane, Apocynon cannabinum. It has quite a wild look, which is what attracts me to it. Small umbelliferous white flowers, slightly glaucous foliage, and pinkish stems. It does self-seed, and it does put out runners, so it requires close attention. But that's what my garden is all about, close attention. So I'm able to grow this, and it's a plant I love. And this is what it looks like in autumn when it goes to seed. I think you can see it's worth a little extra work. Eryngium yucifolium, or rattlesnake master, does well in the garden. It self-seeds. It doesn't expand. I hear that in other gardens with better soil, it often becomes a nuisance because it reproduces itself so rapidly. But that isn't the case for me. I have just enough. Actually, I'd like to have more. This is a plant. It's very common in our area. It's indigenous to my site. But I never knew what it was until I saw a Rick Dark lecture many years ago. It's seed box. It has a rather undistinguished appearance in summer with small flowers, but in autumn the leaves have a nice red color, and its chief feature is these beautiful square seed boxes. Its botanical name is Ludwigia alternifolia. I love that name. Another close-up of the seed box. Another view of the Pedicites. I've given the warning, but look how beautiful those black veins are. This is not the round Pedicites japonicus. It's a hybrid, and I have no idea what hybrid it is. This is a Ligularia japonica growing up through an edge of the Pedicites. It's a beautiful little plant for wet places in the summer. has extraordinarily beautiful foliage. And this is a close-up of its flowers. Its one disadvantage is that it tends to fall apart and flop a lot after it flowers. So I've given up trying to stake it. I just cut it out as necessary. Here is one of my favorite shrubs and small trees. It's Lindera angustifolia from Korea. It's a cousin of our native Lindera benzoin. And like Lindera benzoin, it's totally impervious to deer. They never touch it. This is a beautiful shrub. Actually, it becomes a small multi-stem tree in time. It's a beautiful shrub because of its color. Here we see an orangey red. Other trees, other Linderas turn yellow, some turn orange, some turn mixtures of colors, and they all keep their foliage through winter. The leaves will gradually turn to a sort of brown suede tan, but they stay on the tree until new foliage emerges in the spring. So it can be quite useful because of that characteristic. Another thing about this tree is its versatility. It grows very well in the wettest parts of my garden, down around the prairie. It grows very well on the bank, which is much drier than the prairie area. It grows very well here on the terrace, and it grows in front of the house in shade. So both sun and shade, wet and drier conditions, and the deer don't eat it. What more could you want? Oh, and it keeps its leaves through the winter, but it's not native. Another Lindera, you can see the dramatic difference in color. A dogwood, Cornus florida. I've given up trying to plant these because they all die of anthracnose eventually. So I let them self-seed on the bank and keep them as temporary plants. This is the native Lindera benzoin, also self-seeded on the bank with a nice yellow color. And this is sassafras. I've tried to put it down in the prairie garden because I want it to grow at the edges, but it hates the wet conditions and dies. I've killed several in that way. It self-seeds, however, on the bank with no problem. Rus glabra laciniata, growing on the terrace outside the living room. It used to be on the bank, but it scrambled up to the terrace and is trying to eat the house now. I really love the plant. It's even beautiful in winter, just looking out the living room windows. It has a beautiful structure in the winter. And I haven't mentioned the beauty of dead plants, one of the real lessons I think Pete Adolph taught us. This is Silphium perfoliatum, the cup plant, the prairie plant, in late autumn. I think it's extraordinarily beautiful. It reminds me of some sort of metalwork by Benvenuto Cellini, an imaginary piece of metalwork. It will eventually crumble, of course. I've mentioned this plant, Inula racemosa Sonnenspier. This is a colony of it around that former weeping Japanese cherry, which I've turned into a giant snag. It begins to color a little in autumn, turns yellow, the seed heads become more prominent and get larger, and eventually the leaves will turn brown, and on in rainy days will look black and hang straight down. It becomes very sculptural. This is the same plant after the foliage has died. It's quite dramatic. And this is the same plant against a bit of miscanthus. I haven't mentioned the miscanthus in my garden because many people disapprove of it because it self-seeds. My intent was to use many American grasses, but I haven't found any that can survive in the long term. Panicum, for example, most of them do well for a few years, but their roots don't resist incursion from the sides, and they gradually just disappear. Some of the larger panicums, like Dallas Blues, last longer. I'm still looking for other grasses that can survive in the garden. But meanwhile, I'm very happy with the miscanthus. I think everyone will have an interest in the care of this garden. It's a matter of management more than maintenance. It's a process rather than a list of rules. It's a process because you have to have a knowledge of the plants, how they respond to their living conditions and to different kinds of weather. It's not complex. You just have to know what to look for and what to expect. The only major laborious management task in the whole year is in late winter or early spring, when we cut most of the grasses and all of the herbaceous perennials to the ground. I used to burn more, but I've taken to heart the lessons of Roberta McMacken, the director of horticulture at Brooklyn Bridge Park, who is very interested in preserving and increasing biodiversity, and in particular insect life. So I try to cut as late as possible and keep the cut grasses and herbaceous material on the ground for as long as possible before eventually disposing of it. I do leave a lot to add to the organic matter in the soil. This is a view just to give you perspective. And when I used to burn, this is what it looked like. I would burn one grass at a time. I don't recommend anyone try this. It's dangerous. You have to be well prepared. And as I said, it destroys insect life. So I've almost completely eliminated burning as a management tool. After the garden is cut to the ground, the garden is bare for probably 2 months, March and most of April, when plants begin to emerge. You'll see early signs of life, pussy willows, emerging foliage. There's just enough structure in the garden. Here you see a stone wall and a pathway. There are a few evergreens, and I leave a few grasses standing to create a kind of park-like atmosphere. And frankly, after living with my immersive garden for a year, I welcome 2 months of a bit of nothingness. We've talked about the rightness of the plants to the conditions, but in the garden, I also had to consider materiality and rightness for place. This is an aerial photo showing an edge of the terrace in the upper left with a small reflecting pool, and a reflecting pool 12 feet below it at mid-right. Those geometric blobs are miscanthus. If you've ever wondered what your garden would look like from above, If it has miscanthus, this is it. The materiality, again, is simple. Rock, cut stone, wood, the wood of the Wave Hill chairs, and in this scene, probably water. I think I would consider that a material of the garden. This is the reflecting pool up on the terrace. Very simple design. The stone coping is recycled stone that had been used around the house probably for the last 50 years. This is the lower reflecting pool. I show it because there's a new material here. That sculpture is bronze and it's extremely heavy. I would not be able to lift it. But it's has a very dark finish, and it has an organic form. Reminds me of a magnified pollen grain or seed pod, so it blends in well with the organic forms of the surrounding planting. Again, speaking of materiality, there's a small wooden bridge across the canal pond. I call it a canal pond because I want to make reference to the canals on both sides of the Delaware River, which is just below us. They're such an important part of our history and of our culture, even to the present day. I'm surprised how many people who visit the garden think this is a flowing stream, which it definitely isn't. Again, speaking of materiality, we use the native stone that's all over. It's buried. Wherever you dig a hole, you will encounter this stone. We have piles of it along both edges of the property. So I used it liberally to make stone walls. It's argillite. Old-timers call it blue jingle or blue jingler because it tends to ring when you hit two rocks together. Again, simple materiality, argillite used to make the stone circle, a bit of metal and a little mobile hanging an out of the way tree, stone, wood, gravel, stone, wood, gravel. I used to have large Japanese willows overhanging the stone circle, and they created a very dark, somber atmosphere, which I liked a lot. But they were attacked by insects, I think the red-spotted lanternfly, and quickly deteriorated, and I had to remove them. Again, another sculpture. This is bronze and very heavy. And the orange shrubs beside it are Lindera and Gustifolia. Eventually these will grow into small multi-stem trees and become a little grove. Wave Hill chairs in a large path across the prairie. This is the only path across the prairie. It's a great place to sit when the growth is low and you can see everything in the garden. Later in the season, in late summer and autumn, you can't see out, and this becomes a very private place to sit. And another scene. This is the terrace outside the house. There's a little bit of fog. The chairs are lined up very rigidly, looking out toward the garden, parallel with the house. And there's something else I see here. It's the emptiness, which seems to be charged with a kind of energy or an immanence. Tom Stuart Smith has written about this feeling when he encountered a small garden in Italy, of going in, and he said he had the feeling that the gods had just departed. I think there's something of that feeling here. I think this is an experience we would all like to achieve in our gardens. It's a very meaningful one to me. I hope the photograph communicates that feeling. Dark and light are a feature of a clearing in the woods because the sun rises and shines through the trees on the eastern side of the garden and then sets on the western side of the garden. And as the light shines through the trees, beams of light highlight certain plants and cast others into darkness. This is Miscanthus purpurescens in a beam of sunlight in autumn. This is Carex crenita, incidentally the largest of the American carexes, with great blue lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica. I think a real study in chiaroscuro. Inula racemosa and Molinia sky racer are given real drama by the light of the afternoon sun. This would be a very dull scene without this side lighting. This is the woodland garden at the side of the house. Again, dappled light and shade, constantly changing through the afternoon. This is way back in the back of the garden in the morning. Just another illustration of the dramatic change in lighting from light to dark. These are those two Wave Hill chairs on the immersion path across the prairie in very early summer when you can sit out and observe the entire garden at a glance. And a view from those chairs across the prairie with the sun backlighting the river birch and the low grasses and forbs in the early summer. And in autumn, an end of the terrace, rather nondescript area that just comes to life when the sun shines through as it's about to set. A nearby area with autumn colors and the setting sun. And another view. This is actually late morning light, but the play of shadow and light is a source of great pleasure. I haven't actually mentioned spirit of place, but that's what I was getting at when I showed you this picture early in my presentation. I do think this land has a certain spirit of place, a certain character. I've mentioned the wizened dead tree on the left and the cloud of yellow leaves behind and the dark verticals of the junipers. It's not a beautiful planting, but it's a highly characterful planting, and it suggests things that might be kept and made a part of the garden. And I hope I've done that. This is a picture of my book, which should be available March 1st. Kathy?
Thank you so much, James. That was terrific. It was a great tour through your garden, and we do have some questions that I will relay. So Laurel asks, knowing what you know now, is there something that you would do differently?
I should have an answer to that question. I don't think so. I enjoy this process. Well, I should put that in the present tense. I enjoy this process because it's a continuing process. There's certain things that get repeated every year, And I also constantly seek out new plants. Uh, for example, last year I discovered many new Amsonias I hadn't tried and discovered they grow very well in my wet conditions. And I'm looking forward to experimenting with those. So, no, I wouldn't have done anything major differently.
Mary asks, do you have deer?
Oh, I didn't mention we have a deer fence around most of the garden. We have a huge number of deer. Uh, I do have plantings on the other side of the house, which is also part of the garden, but it is outside the deer fence. So I have gradually discovered there are some things deer don't eat. I know that's a risky statement to make, but they have never touched Lindera angustifolia or Lindera benzoin. They hate grasses, so they won't eat any of the grasses I plant. I have a lot of native carex, and I've planted a lot more carex, and I've planted many ferns in the front. They don't eat ferns, and they don't eat carex. So I wouldn't have tried to have the largest part of my garden without a deer enclosure. But it is possible to have a garden with deer.
Yep. Yeah, I found that they stay away from a lot of that Lindera too. Barbara is asking about the name of the tall, dark innula, and she also wonders if you have a plant list for this talk or if there's one in your book.
There's no plant list in the book, though the index does, I think, identify every plant shown in a photograph. I'm pretty sure it does. The indexer did a very good job. I do have a plant list, and I would be happy to share it. I won't guarantee it's totally up to date, but it's pretty up to date. I'm not sure what mechanism to use to get it to people, though.
And she asked about the innula too. We could probably email the list to everyone when as a follow-up to the talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
The name is Inula, I-N-U-L-A, Racemosa, R-A-C-E-M-O-S-A, and then Sonnenspeer, S-O-N-N-E-N-S-P-E-E-R, which I think means sun ray. And I heard of it when reading about.
Named.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I don't think I remembered to mention that it self-seeds profusely, so it requires attention.
Yes. And she asks for the name of the Himalayan plant that you mentioned.
Oh, that was the Himalayan plant. And I don't know, I've never been able to find its source.
Mary asks, the green mulch, equisetum, is that direct seeded or planted in plugs?
I don't think there's. I have it because it was growing here when we bought the house. Many people consider it to be a pernicious and horrible weed. So I don't know if the seed is sold. I'm sorry, but I would warn anyone to think carefully before planting it, because you'll never get rid of it.
And the species on that is
our Equisetum arvense, A-R-V-E-N-S-E.
Yeah, yeah. And once you have it, it's impossible to get rid of.
I think so.
Yeah. You mentioned reading a lot before starting your garden. What did you read, and what was the most influential? From Kristen. I know that you have a great reference, a few pages in the back of your book. But so Kristen, you can start there, but also go ahead, James.
Uh, well, I of course read all of the Pete Outolf books, which are really Noel Kingsbury books, and Noel's other books. I think Noel is very much a scientist as well as a plantsman. He introduced work the Germans did on perennials and how they grow in the early to mid 20th century. Information that simply wasn't available in English. It's now also available in Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. It's a virtual primer in that material. That's another wonderful book too. Did I say I mentioned all the Pete Outolf books? I love Tim Richardson as a garden writer. He has a wonderful book on the history of the English landscape garden called, I think, Gentlemen Farmers. Also many other books. I love Rick Dark's books, Dan Pearson's books. I'm sure there are people around me in America who I just can't think of right now.
So I'll go to the next question then. Jess asks, how did you create the canal?
We built a stone wall around the base of the not around the base of the house, but around the base of the bank coming down from the terrace, because it was just a mess. It needed a defining edge. And we had so much native stone lying about, it was pretty easy to do. My garden helper, Milton, and his father did that. And once they finished the wall, they pointed behind it and said, I think they said, dirt, we need dirt here. There was just empty space behind the wall. So we had to find a source. So I said, let's dig a pond here, and used that to fill in behind the wall. So it came about by happy accident. And I wouldn't be without a pond, because the water life is wonderful. There are hundreds of frogs. I'll stop.
Well, speaking of water features, I wondered what were the design considerations that influenced your placement of the reflecting pools?
The lower reflecting pool is below the bank, so it's sort of hard to see it from the house level. And I liked making it a kind of surprise.
Yeah.
So that's what influenced the placement.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It is a surprise. Janet asks, how large is the garden?
All told, including the front, it's quite small, about 1.5 acres. That's probably a generous estimate. But as I said, it's hard to say where the garden ends and the woods begin, because the woods are so much a part of it, part of the atmosphere and the sense of place.
And you mentioned a lot about open and close, and the garden pushing back. And I wonder if in the spring, is there any tension that exists in the garden, or is it a different feel then?
It's a very different feel, because probably until late May, you can stand and look across the garden. It's wonderful just to look at the emerging growth and the geometric patterns of the plants as they emerge and take on different heights. But it's a very different experience from the garden from midsummer on.
Pam asks, did writing your book teach you anything about your garden that you hadn't thought about before?
I think it made me more aware of the sense of the garden pushing back and how meaningful that might be. Uh, I had experienced in Garden Conservancy open days when people would get lost and ask me which way to go. And initially I felt a little bit annoyed. I thought, you just walk the paths and that's it. And I realized this was a serious issue that I should address and think about. And then later I encountered the idea again in some of Tom Stuart Smith's, a great British garden designer, in some of his talks. He did not use the term "the garden pushes back, that's mine," but I think I use it because it's dramatic and it sort of makes the point that I think there are parts of the earth where we shouldn't be. There are places where we shouldn't be in the sense of utility and capitalistic development.
Yeah.
Did I run on?
No. I'll finish off with the last question here. Are garden tours available?
Yes, there is one planned for the Garden Conservancy, an open day on June 12th of this year, which is really pushing it. It's quite early for my garden, but I'm willing to, open for people when they call. If I, get 75 calls, I might have to figure out how to work that out. But I usually bring anyone in who wants to see the garden.
Yeah, and if they can't visit, they can certainly get a good sense from your new book, which
You can buy the book.
the text is great and the photos are really breathtaking. So you can really get a sense of your garden through the book. Well, thank you so much, James. This has been a treat, and we appreciate you talking with us tonight. Our next lecture is in person here at Wave Hill for a change, and that's on March 30th at 5 p.m. And that's Lehman Chang. He'll be talking about Little Island, A Garden Rises. And it will also be followed by some socializing with a light reception afterwards. So we hope you can join us then too. So that concludes tonight's event, and we appreciate you coming. Take care.